Hello, welcome back to part 3 of our asynchronous lecture series, A Digital Dialogue with the Creating Social Media Presence and Cultural Movements class. And we're engaging a number of texts, we're engaging a number of questions, and most importantly, engaging a number of students with their questions about the readings. And we're moving right along here. And Chia has some questions, starting with how to build a brand and change the world by sparking cultural movements. It's Scott Goodson's Uprising book. And she has some nice questions coming out of the preface. And the first question writes, the book says that movements may not change the result, but it can arouse people to understand the power of movement. I think people are good at forgetting, especially in the era of information explosion. Great term there. What is the real meaning of these movements? Oh, wow. Well, what is the meaning of life, right? Terrific question. I can feel the cognitive process unfolding here, and I think this is such a healthy exercise for us. You're tapping into an important idea here, and that is that sometimes it's not about quote unquote winning, a movement. It may be whether it's a political movement, social movement. There are a lot of social justice movements in the U.S., especially kind of Western Europe, where we have more democratic nations, and I think that's where a lot of that stems from. Is nations where free speech is championed, and the stakes in terms of punishment are lower for those stakeholders, for those citizens. And so using our voice to kind of help propel a platform is valuable. It's empowering, can be empowering for the organization, for the idea itself. It's empowering it at an individual level. It's getting us engaged as in our citizenry, right? Civic discourse is a foundational tier of deliberative democracy. It's what we're supposed to be able to practice this, and we definitely should appreciate it. Tricky thing is, sometimes we just don't have time to participate in it, and a lot of people don't have the information, right, to be able to maybe actively have a say, or plenty of people, millions of people on social media have a say. It's just whether or not we have an informed say or not. That makes a huge difference, okay? I don't know if I answered that accurately, but it's certainly the response that is appropriate to the topic. Next question. In China, we basically do not have this kind of movement, but it's very common in the U.S. We know that some of the movements are positive, but others are not. That's fair assessment. What does the United States do in dealing with movements with possible negative results? I think this is, a lot of people, one of the most popular bandwagoning techniques on social media in recent years is running down our news organizations, right? And let's be clear. First of all, let me do my best to be objective here. And that gets at the crux of one of the, tenets of ethical journalism. So I'm tying both books together here, right? Talking about the interviewing for journalists. But, practicing peak ethics as often as possible is always going to put us in a position to, not have to cover up, not have to be dishonest, to make fair judgments, to kind of practice without, with less compromise, with less hypocrisy, democratic values or whatever. But to the question, what does the U.S. do in dealing with movements that have negative results? This is a point I'm trying to make. I'm trying to advocate that our freedom of the press, that our media organizations do help steer narratives, and they do involve people that are what used to be considered opinion makers, right? We've moved away from this other term, public intellectuals. I don't know that we place a high value on public intellectuals anymore. I'm being completely honest. I think we put a lot of stock and value in celebrity. I think we put a lot of stock and value in, charisma, maybe even outlandishness, right? Someone that's willing to kind of buck the trend or go against the grain of what our expectations are of how you speak in public or what you do. But in terms of public intellectuals, we've really taken a step kind of away from that. And maybe it has to do with the nature of deep intellect and how that's often hard to kind of translate in a mass way to the broadest possible public, right? But let me use maybe a recent example to highlight how that could be a good, right? So the Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is helping oversee the U.S. government's handling of the sort of coronavirus, COVID-19 outbreak, particularly in the U.S., and his manner of taking a lot of heavy scientific information, potentially alarming information and ideas, and kind of presenting it in a calm and a rational and assuring way, kind of like a health physician, right? Like kind of like the best doctor you've ever gone to. That's a public intellectual being able to break through, being able to break those barriers. And he's being employed and utilized by conservative, we have conservative politicians in power, right? The presidential administration is conservative in nature, and we of course we have representatives on both sides of the ideological spectrum in this country, but Fauci's able to work with both groups. Both groups are kind of giving him respect and place to sort of administer information, and I think that's a healthy way, right? That's that ideal pursuit of compromise in our political setup. But the news media can help. You've heard that term, watchdogs, and media watchdogs. That idea that these news organizations and outlets, they're there to help with the checks and balances system, right? To help spotlight corruption, maybe, but they should also be championing positives, and I think they still do. I think we're just at a rough crossroads in terms of the blurring of the lines of presenting news as entertainment, as drama, right? As melodrama, even when that's not its core function. And the problem with presenting news as melodrama is now it's so clear we're chasing ratings and entertaining that we're going to easily get sidetracked, preferring, controversy over, information that just seeks to inform and educate. And I would point, I can point that in both directions along those sort of news fronts. I do think regional news, as kind of campy as it is, I don't see a lot of heavy-handed, political diatribes coming out of, regional news as often. It's more of that national news, cable news network type of situation. Those programs that get the older generations stirred up right these days. I think you know what I'm talking about. What is a movement, and why should it matter to your company? Chapter 1. When I read the first chapter, it reminds me of event marketing. To build a good brand image, companies like to hire social celebrities or use social events to arouse the interest and attention of the media and consumers to their brand and product. Therefore, what strategy companies usually take to make better connection between their brand and the social events to improve their brand images? And I think that's the kind of thing we can put out on a wider net and sort of gauge what you all bring to the table with that. But let me move on to the follow-up question. That asks, what is the relationship between social movements and marketing? An ideal question to promote a product or concept to the public. And I think this is a sit tight and hang on and be looking for those breadcrumbs, or if you know what I mean, in the Uprising book from Scott Goodson. He's gonna connect the dots a little bit for us, right? Like draw those lines to help us understand that sometimes it's about a social movement, and then that idea gets kind of used in marketing, or sometimes marketers use the power of social movements purely for the sake of monetization, right? To commodify some idea into product form for profit, right? And hey, stimulating the economy is not a bad thing. And we need jobs, and we need advertising jobs, we need marketing jobs, and public relations jobs, communication positions and professions. And we still want to make ethical decisions within those. But sometimes, this book is also showing us that great strategies make money, right? And so we know that's a core tenet of business and business school, is a profit-driven logic. And so keep that in mind, that Scott Goodson is bouncing back and forth between giving us these using social issues, and talking about those kinds of cultural movements, but also swinging hard back into economic types of case studies. Examples where advertising succeeded in a big way. But let me close out Chow's questions. Interviewing for Journalists, Chapter 1. In this chapter, it mentioned the use of voice recorders during interviews. I like this question a lot. I agree with the view in the book that shorthand is necessary. It's talking about shorthand, like learning, figuring out a shorthand when you're note-taking. Absolutely an essential tool. You should be doing it in school. I don't know when note-taking just completely went out of fashion, but I see that as an issue today. You want to develop a shorthand. However, my instinct tells me that we should not rely on voice recorders all the time. Will the use of voice recorders affect the interviewee's status and make their answers more restrictive? This is an excellent question. It can make them more restrictive. I think traditionally, what I do see though is we're in a society that's increasingly interlocked with technology. And it's almost a given that digital recordings are kind of a part of that. What you do want to do is put your interviewee always in a situation of maximum comfort. And what I mean is you're trying to lower their apprehension. And this is why, just like I've talked about sending them questions in advance, you always want to articulate what your intent is. You're going to record it, you let them know. If it's a phone interview and you're recording it, let them know. If you're if in any way you plan to replicate their actual voice, right? The replaying of that any other way, that has to come with consent, right? They have to consent with that recording, right? That broadcast, the use of that. And another follow-up question that closes: if we use a voice recorder but do not tell the interviewee, is this illegal? Now, in a corporate setting, you could absolutely commit some sort of corporate crimes, and that's quite dangerous. Is it illegal if you have a conversation with someone and you've recorded what they say? No. And people do it all the time. It gets into, is it ethical if you share it, right? This is where, we see a lot of this kind of gotcha stuff where somebody's recorded celebrity or politician like yelling at someone and using profanity or some kind of thing, and then we use it to bury them, right? We're gonna cancel them, as they say on Twitter or whatever. And it's not that is illegal, but there are ethical questions about it. And I think if you're a journalist, if you're a reporter, here's some essential you've got to remember. But really, any kind of paid employee, if you're doing this for work of any kind, always think about, what is this in my long-term interest to burn, someone by either going behind their back to do something, right? So the more transparent we can be, the healthier the relationship. And that transparency, even if it means recording them and telling them that's what you're doing, that transparency should offset any concern they have, right? In fact, it may lead them to try harder, right? Articulate themselves even more as a result. So I think it's a good thing. I think I've talked about in our week 1 lecture, I've talked about diminishing attention spans and how even in this segment, the quality of note taking. I mean, both of these have taken a downward turn. So we've kind of come to a place of relying on that technology, right? If attention spans and note taking are both on the decline, then how are we to assume? Why would we assume that our memory is of such a superior quality? All right. I read all the time. Relatively intelligent on a number of fronts, but it doesn't. That doesn't mean that where was I going with that? All right, I had a personal anecdote to kind of tie this up. But that doesn't mean that just because I recall a lot of things, I have deep memory of certain subject matters, doesn't mean I'm gonna have a lockjaw. That's the wrong term. A perfected recall of interview exchange, of verbal communication with another person, especially the longer you wait after the interview to transcribe the notes of what was reported. This is why memory, just pure memory doesn't hold up in court any longer, right? You need the physical evidence to go with it. You can no longer have seen somebody in the dark and there's no mistaking it, right? I knew it was them. That doesn't fly anymore. Society has kind of progressed past that point, and we recognize the gaps we have, the regular flaws in human cognition. How does development of technology affect interviewers? As we know, self-media has a large market nowadays. What kind of impact of the self-media is put on the quality of daily news? Okay, so I think I understand what's going on here. I'll be brief. Journalism and news media is definitely up against the ropes, to use a boxing term. There are fewer subscribers than ever. There are fewer people paying for newspapers. I wouldn't say that the number of people that pay for those private firewall access to newspapers, news websites, that number is not as high as the people that used to buy the newspaper. They're in dire straits, right? They're not doing great. And that's why they are relying on these tactics like, sensationalism or whatever to kind of drive some of those sales. And social media has changed the game, and we, the lay people, are in competition with professional news. Let me use a hot topic this week. It's already set itself on fire, and then we're sort of laughing and dancing at the ashes at this point. But this, air quotes documentary titled Plandemic came out, and people were rushing to share it on social media and pass it around and include certain types of questions like, think for yourself, and it's important to ask questions. And these are kind of like open terms and phrases, right? It's like, well, yeah, what those words mean is positive. But if we don't have a gauge for understanding, like telling the difference between what a trustworthy source and an untrustworthy source is, then, that's the root problem. Not that misinformation is being passed around. Fortunately, it didn't take long for all of the people that are locked and loaded with, critical thinking skills and informed decision making and argumentation to just demolish this essentially a conspiracy theory masquerading as a documentary But this, this whole idea of, pandemic, people, the people that share that include their little commentaries, that they're not helping information, in a positive way. They're not real competition for journalists. They're real competition for our attention spans. They're real competition for like information and even feelings that we're having when we're seeing and interacting with those things. But it's important that we recognize that there's a value role for journalists and journalism, and demonizing them all the time is not the solution. And phony baloney alternative news is also not the solution, right? The solution is reform, right? Reform what journalism is, what it can be. And reform, what does the definition of reform mean? Even in a dictionary sense, right? Connotative meaning. Let's draw back to its essence, to its basics, right? It should serve the public good. And that hasn't collapsed completely. It's just confused, right? It's at a confused place. And maybe it has to do with society's maybe confused preferences for other things. And I think in the U.S. we're guilty of over desiring entertainment over information, right? Information over education, right? And so on and so on. And so, it's a muddled mess that we have to navigate with. All right, we'll shut down the lecture series for now, but rest assured, we'll be back. We'll tackle more questions. We're going to get into even more content in the days and weeks to come.